Britain's empire is gone, so why are British military bases still scattered across the world map? Look at the locations. Gibraltar, at the mouth of the Mediterranean. Cyprus, in the eastern Mediterranean, 200 miles from the Syrian coast. An island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The South Atlantic, 8,000 miles from London. The Persian Gulf, the coast of Oman. The jungles of Borneo. These are not historical markers. They are active military installations staffed today by British soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The British Empire that built them is more than 70 years gone. The question isn't whether these bases still exist. They clearly do. The question is why, what purpose they serve, who decides to keep them, and what they tell us about the country Britain has chosen to become. That answer is more interesting than it first appears. To understand why Britain still has bases across the world, you have to understand why it built them in the first place, and what happened when the empire ended. At its peak, British imperial power was sustained by naval reach. A network of bases, coaling stations, and garrison towns stretched across every ocean. Each one was positioned to control a trade route, a choke point, or a critical stretch of sea. This was not sentiment, it was logistics. Britain's wealth depended on keeping those routes open, and keeping them open required places to resupply, repair, and project force. When the Second World War ended, so did the economics that made this possible. Britain emerged from the war exhausted and heavily in debt. The empire was winding down, and the military infrastructure built to sustain it was becoming unaffordable. The decisive moment came in January 1968. Prime Minister Harold Wilson and his Defense Secretary Denis Healey announced that British forces would be withdrawn from their main bases east of Suez, Singapore, Malaysia, the Gulf, by 1971. This is sometimes described as an economic collapse, something forced on Britain by circumstances it could not control. But that framing understates the agency involved. The evidence points to a deliberate political choice. The Wilson government consciously decided to redirect resources from Britain's overseas military role toward domestic social spending. The empire was not simply lost, it was, to a considerable degree, given up. What remained after 1968 was not random. The installations that survived were those where the argument for staying was strong enough to resist the pressure to leave. Gibraltar, still guarding the mouth of the Mediterranean. Cyprus, too useful as a forward staging post to abandon. A handful of bilateral arrangements that served British interests on their own terms, independent of the imperial logic that had once held them together. The result was a smaller, more selective footprint. Not empire, but not nothing. So what does that footprint actually do today? 7 locations, 6 strategic functions. What follows is not a survey of imperial nostalgia. It is a map of working infrastructure. The Strait of Gibraltar is 14 kilometers wide. Tens of thousands of vessels pass through those 14 kilometers every year. Britain has maintained a military presence on the Rock for over 300 years. Gibraltar's harbour, runway, and communications infrastructure are today a NATO asset, positioned at the exact point where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean. The Spain sovereignty dispute over Gibraltar is real and unresolved. But sovereignty disagreements and strategic value are not the same thing. Whatever the political future of the territory, the geography of its location is not going to change. The British sovereign base areas at Akrotiri and Dhekelia are not a lease, and they are not a negotiated access deal. They are UK sovereign territory, 98 square miles retained when Cyprus became independent in 1960. RAF Akrotiri is a permanent joint operating base. It functions as a forward-mounting base for British military operations across the Middle East. Its value is geographical. From Akrotiri, British aircraft are within range of the eastern Mediterranean and much of the Middle East. In the middle of the Indian Ocean lies Diego Garcia, a joint UK-US military facility used for long-range operations, logistics, and intelligence. Its isolation is precisely the point. It is one of the most remote military installations on Earth, surrounded by open ocean in every direction. The island is part of the Chagos archipelago, and that raises a question this video cannot resolve because the law has not resolved it either. The original inhabitants, the Chagosians, were displaced in the late 1960s and early 1970s to allow the base to be built. A treaty signed in May 2025 would hand sovereignty of the archipelago to Mauritius, while the UK retains a 99-year lease on the Diego Garcia base. As of April 2026, that treaty has stalled. The United States has not given the consent required under a 1966 bilateral agreement, and without that consent, the deal cannot take effect. What is not in doubt is that the base continues to operate. The legal status of the territory around it remains unresolved. 8,000 miles from London, Britain maintains a garrison of approximately 1,200 service personnel at Mount Pleasant Complex in the South Atlantic. Typhoon jets have provided continuous air defense since 1988. The mission, as stated in official documents, is to deter military action against the South Atlantic overseas territories. Argentina's sovereignty claim over the islands has never been withdrawn. The garrison exists to make the calculation clear. In 2018, Britain opened its first permanent naval base east of Suez since the 1971 withdrawal. The UK Naval Support Facility at Bahrain, HMS Jufair, supports mine countermeasure vessels and a Type 23 frigate assigned permanently to the Gulf. The facility sits alongside the headquarters of the US Fifth Fleet. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of global petroleum liquids passes each day, is nearby. Britain's ships here operate as part of combined maritime forces, alongside American, Australian, and other allied navies. The 2018 opening was not incidental. It was a deliberate return to a region Britain had formerly left 47 years earlier. Not every presence requires ownership. The final category in Britain's global footprint is the Access Agreement, arrangements that give Britain the use of facilities it does not own and does not garrison in the traditional sense. In Oman, a joint defense agreement signed in 2019 secures long-term access to military facilities. A joint logistics base at Duqm, opened in 2018, is positioned outside the Persian Gulf and can support Britain's carrier strike group as it moves through the Indian Ocean. If the Strait of Hormuz were ever closed, Duqm's position becomes critical. In Brunei, approximately 2,000 British personnel, centered on a Gurkha infantry battalion, have been based since Brunei's independence in 1984 at the request of the Sultan. The arrangement is renewed every 5 years. It includes the Jungle Warfare School, a training institution whose value extends well beyond Brunei's own territory. Together, Oman and Brunei represent what much of Britain's overseas military presence has become. Not garrisons imposed on reluctant hosts, but durable bilateral arrangements maintained because both sides find them useful. Step back from the individual locations and look at the pattern. The Atlantic approaches, Gibraltar, the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, Cyprus, the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia and the Duqm facility in Oman, the South Atlantic, the Falklands, the Persian Gulf, Bahrain, Southeast Asia, Brunei. This is not a random collection of leftovers. It is a network that sits across some of the world's most commercially critical shipping lanes, and the waters through which most of the world's crises have historically unfolded. Britain's most recent Defence Command paper describes this infrastructure as a deliberate priority, framing it as an integrated global defence network. The Integrated Review Refresh of 2023 sets out why. Britain sees itself as a country with global interests that require global reach. The honest question is whether this posture is sustainable. Britain's defence budget is under pressure. These commitments carry real costs. Some locations, Diego Garcia above all, come with significant political complexity. There are legitimate arguments about whether a medium-sized economy can maintain genuine global military reach without strategic overstretch. But the practical case for the footprint is not difficult to state. Remove this footprint, and Britain loses something that cannot easily be rebuilt: access, allied credibility, the ability to act alongside the United States in regions where proximity matters, and the capacity to respond to crises without depending entirely on the goodwill of countries that may not share British interests. What this network represents is the infrastructure of a deliberate choice: to remain a country that can operate beyond its own borders. So, why does Britain still have military bases around the world? Not because of sentimentality, not because successive governments forgot to close them, not because Britain is still pretending the empire is intact. These bases exist because geography is persistent. The Strait of Gibraltar will still be 14 kilometers wide in 50 years. The Indian Ocean will still separate Asia, Africa, and Australia. The South Atlantic will still be 8,000 miles from London. The Persian Gulf will still matter. Empires come and go, but the locations that make them strategically valuable tend to remain useful long after the empire itself has gone. Britain's overseas military presence is smaller than it once was, more selective and more dependent on alliances and bilateral agreements than on unilateral control. But it is not a museum, it is a network, and it is still working.